Cultural encounters are a central theme in the story of the human past. Over thousands of years, and across thousands of leagues, people met one another to exchange goods and ideas. They may have spoken different languages, consumed different foods, worshipped different gods, and obeyed different laws, but still they made contact. Through contact, they made connections. People sometimes connected in battle, sometimes in commerce, and sometimes they connected through a shared musical inheritance.
The sarode is an instrument from India. There's different versions of where it may have come from, what its origins are. Some people suggest that it's actually the result of an amalgamation of 2 or 3 very, very ancient instruments.
Oud started in the Arab world. Long time ago, it started with 4 strings. It started spread through the Silk Road into China, through Persia, Azerbaijan, India, the Mongols, up to China.
The word lute, of course, comes from alud, sounds like alud. Europeans thought that they were imitating the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So strangely, though the actual historical pedigree of the instrument is Arabic, they thought of the instrument as being associated with the Greek lyre.
From Mesopotamia to China, from Egypt to England, from Andalusia to Latin America, cultural connections made it possible for people to hear music played on the same extended family of instruments. This remarkable family traveled on the Silk Road and the high seas. It was represented by the oud in its original homeland of Arabia and much of the Middle East, the pipa in China, the sarod in northern India, and the guitar across the Spanish Atlantic. The family's representative in Western Europe provided the common English name now used for many of its members, the lute.
My name is Bassam Bishara Shahouk. I'm from Upper Galilee in Israel. I play the oud, play some other Middle Eastern instruments like the qanun, or the buzuk, or the saz, like Middle Eastern instruments. But most important and beloved instrument is the oud for me.
The oud was an instrument much beloved in classical Arab civilization. A 9th century jurist in Baghdad extolled the instrument's healing properties in treating illness, and the 10th century esoteric philosophers, the Brethren of Purity, called the oud the most perfect instrument devised by the sages, and the best of their creations.
So the oud consists of like 6 parts, major parts: the pigs and the pig's box, the neck, sound box, the face of the oud, the bridge, and we call those the shamsiya and the kamarat. Shamsiya means the sun and the moons. The oud is started 90%. We have lots of discussion about the origins of the oud. So, but most likely it's from Mesopotamia, Sumerian and the Akkadian. From that period, which is about 2800 BC. But the latest discovery, it was from Uruk, which we call it Ur, southern part of Iraq or Mesopotamia, It's 3,500 BC. They found the same shape of the oud, exactly the same thing, the same as they found in Egypt for the 18th dynasty, which is 1500 BC.
The ancient Sumerian city-state of Uruk was occupied for at least 5,000 years. By about 3000 BCE, it was the largest urban center in Mesopotamia and possibly the largest settlement in the world. It was known not only for its architecture of mud brick platforms and temple buildings, but also for its literary hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, in one of the world's oldest surviving pieces of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Contemporary with ancient Mesopotamia was a civilization in Egypt whose 18th dynasty is one of the best understood of all ancient periods, thanks to a relative abundance of historical records. It is probably most famous for its remarkable pharaohs such as Hatshepsut, who during her reign of more than 20 years established strong international trading relationships and brought great wealth to Egypt. Her expedition in 1493 BCE to the land of Punt, an area somewhere to the south of Egypt, brought back ebony, ivory, frankincense, and even living myrrh trees to be transplanted into Egyptian soil. Other pharaohs of the 18th dynasty included Akhenaten, who along with his wife Nefertiti, introduced a new form of worship centered on the sun disk, and Tutankhamun, who died at the age of 19 and whose burial mask remains one of the most recognizable symbols for ancient Egypt.
After they started to develop the oud in Mesopotamia, starting in the Hijaz, which is a part of Saudi Arabia now. The Hijaz was the core of the Middle Eastern music at that time, pre-Islamic period, between 1st and 5th century. But it was forbidden after the Islamic period, which is on the 6th or 7th century. So all those musicians fled from the peninsula, Saudi Peninsula or Arabian Peninsula, to the northern part. They settled in Iraq, and it started to spread through the Silk Road into China, through Persia, Azerbaijan, India, the Mongols, up to China. I consider the pipa as the first son of the father, which is the oud.
The Silk Road linked societies across the breadth of Eurasia. Actually a series of routes rather than a single road, it was named after one of its most famous items of trade, silk, although along it also traveled spices, gems, religious missionaries, and musicians. Toward the eastern end of the Silk Road was China, and the Chinese relative of the oud, the pipa, fittingly had strings made of twisted silk. The pipa was introduced to China on several different occasions, possibly emerging for the first time in about 200 BCE during the Han Dynasty. From China, the pipa traveled still further, spreading to Japan and Korea.
The oud is struck by plectrum. We don't play it by finger. It's fretless, so we can get tone, half tone, and quarter tone. Even in the Turkish music and Persian music, we have 1/3 of the tone, and in Turkish music we have 1/8 and 3/8 of the tone. So you have to be like really very accurate while you're playing this instrument.
Music of the oud flourished in the medieval Islamic world, with an especially brilliant period after its arrival in Al-Andalus, the part of the Iberian Peninsula that was under Muslim control from 711 to 1492. The Andalusian city of Cordoba was a jewel in medieval Europe. At its height, Cordoba's population of about 500,000 inhabitants could enjoy the city's more than 1,000 mosques, 600 public baths, and magnificent public libraries. Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century poet and playwright living in Lower Saxony, called it the ornament of the globe.
Spain, everything has been changed, and they reached the peak of the Arabic music while the Arabs were in Spain.
From Al-Andalus, the oud moved further into Europe, where it changed somewhat in form and in name. Thus, al-oud in Arabic became a lute in English.
Hello, I'm John Edwards, and I'm playing a couple of different lutes from the Renaissance. Comes first into Europe with the Moorish invasion and occupation of what's now Spain. And the word lute, of course, comes from alud. It sounds like alud. It really takes off, though, in the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was the time from about 1400 to about 1600 or 1650, when Europeans thought that they were imitating the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So strangely, though the actual historical pedigree of the instrument is Arabic, they thought of the instrument as being associated with the Greek lyre that you see Orpheus playing. So Orpheus singing to his lyre was for them transposed to this instrument.
The Renaissance was a time in European history when intellectual and cultural leaders developed a newly intensified interest in recovering the classical past of ancient Greece and Rome. Ancient lineages were easier to trace in some art forms than others. Very old buildings might be preserved and restored, very old sculptures unearthed and imitated, very old texts rediscovered and copied. But music, by its very nature, is ephemeral. Music is performed, and when performance stops, so too does the music cease. It could live only in a person's memory, or as a written indication in a form like notation of how a piece of music should be played. Renaissance Europeans did have a few fragments of ancient written music, but no certain knowledge of how to interpret them. So while Renaissance architects and sculptors and writers could turn to examples from antiquity, musicians could not. The Renaissance love of copying antiquity made itself manifest in music through the incorporation of ancient motifs such as Greek and Roman mythology into new compositions, through musical theory, which had largely persisted through the medieval centuries, and also perhaps through an imagined descent of the ancient Greek lyre to the current European lute.
Goes right across Europe and becomes the main instrument. You can still see this lute is a copy of one from the 1580s, and you can still see in the rosette there's sort of a geometric design that's still very arabesque. I mean, you can see the sort of geometry of it. Now it's got some flowers or leaves and things in it, but it's still, even though you're a Western European in the 1500s, if you said, "Oh, you're playing an Arabic instrument," he'd say, "Don't be ridiculous."
The lute was not Europe's only inheritance from the Arab world. Europeans also received from the Arabs, or through Arabic intermediaries, foods like citrus fruits and sugarcane, technological innovations like the pointed arch and water clocks, texts by ancient authors like Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, ideas like algebra, and even games like chess.
And so it's the main accompanying instrument for song for 200 or 300 years. And it becomes a very aristocratic instrument as well. It's not a folk instrument so much. This one has 6 pairs of strings around 1450. Between 1450 and 1500, there's some big changes. They get a 6th pair of strings, and they also stop playing with a plectrum, usually a goose quill. I don't know about eagle feathers, but usually a goose quill they would play. And you see pictures of medieval lute players playing much like you'll see the oud being played. They stopped that about 1475 and started playing with their fingertips.
James IV, King of Scots, played the lute, and he obtained his own lute strings from France. He also had at least 12 other lute players at his court, some of whom are named in the records, such as Jacob Luter, or given more descriptive titles, such as Rankin the Flemish luter and the Suter luter, meaning the shoemaker lute player. King James paid for one of his lutenists to be sent overseas to learn his craft, and he sent a barrel of salmon to a Scottish lutenist staying in Bruges. Music was considered an essential part of life at the royal court. Not only did James IV play the lute, but so did his niece, Elizabeth I, Queen of England.
And as Western music moved from court and into the public concert halls, as you can imagine, this very quiet little instrument starts getting drowned out. So about in the time of Handel and Vivaldi, starts to go out of fashion. By 1750, it's out of fashion, because then you've got to fill a massive concert hall full of 1,500 people who are all murmuring and shuffling their programs. You can imagine the lute goes out of fashion. But as there's been, since the middle of the last century, since about the 1950s, there's been this huge resurgence in early music in Europe. And people are rediscovering this old music, and they're saying, hey, this has something to say to us today. That also goes at the same time as amplification and recordings take off. So I wonder if that has some influence on these instruments, these quiet little instruments being reintroduced more into Western classical music. And that's the lute.
To the southeast of the oud's homeland, there emerged another instrument that at first looks quite different from the oud, but that might be another of its descendants, the sarode of northern India.
My name is Aditya Verma. I am a sarode player. The sarode is an instrument from India, North India actually, and it's representative of the North Indian tradition of classical music, also known as Hindustani music.
Hindustan, named from a Persian word for the region beyond the Indus River, refers to a large part of northern India. During the early modern period, the greatest rulers in the region were the Mughals, descendants from the Mongols of Central Asia. Mughal civilization was a cultural synthesis that included not only Central Asian influences, but also Persian, Arabic, and local North Indian. The Mughal Empire at its height was home to more than 100 million people, and its most famous leader, Akbar, was not only a capable administrator, but also a curious intellectual and champion of diversity in his age. Akbar and all Mughal emperors were adherents to Sunni Islam, but they were a religious minority in the region over which they ruled. The majority of their subjects were Hindu, but others were Shiite, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Sikh. Akbar's inquisitiveness led him to hold weekly gatherings in his beautiful new city of Fatehpur Sikri, gatherings where men from different religions would discuss a variety of subjects in a spirit of open exchange. Akbar's fame spread far and wide. Queen Elizabeth I of England, who played the lute, sent an emissary to his court with a letter from her that spoke of the singular report that is of your imperial majesty's humanity in these uttermost parts of the world.
There's a couple of different versions of where and when our instrument came into being. North Indian music or Hindustani music is something which grew out of the traditional classical music in India, which is there as well before. There was just one form of classical music in India. Then it sort of bifurcated into two separate musics, one which is called Carnatic, which is more prevalent in the south, and South Indian music as they refer to it, and Hindustani, which is in the north. This instrument comes from the north.
The origins of the sarod are unclear. Some scholars have suggested that it is a descendant of the rabab from Afghanistan. However, the first references to it do not appear until the 19th century.
And the people who play this instrument, there's different versions of where it may have come from, what its origins are. Some people suggest that it's actually the result of an amalgamation of 2 or 3 very, very ancient instruments, which are used with a plectrum or which have a sliding neck. There's other versions which suggest that the sarode is a descendant of the rabab from Afghanistan. And there's still another version which suggests it's kind of a mixture of everything, where there was an instrument which is very similar to this in India already, but it adopted certain features of the rabab to make it how it is today. And it went through these changes over the course of the last 200 years or so, they think. From the early 1800s is when they think that the sarode itself came into the form it is today. So, speaking of the instrument that you see in front of you, it's made out of a single piece of teak, and it's hollowed out from the bottom right to the very top. You have 2 sound areas. One is here in the belly of the instrument, and the second is this brass chamber, which is a resonating chamber, also to amplify the sound from the back. The neck of the instrument is covered with a steel plate, which is highly buffed or polished to ease sliding of your fingertips and fingernails on the instrument. As you can see, there's no frets, so we have to use the tip of our finger as well as the tip of our nail to act almost like a movable fret and create that clarity and sharpness of sound. Indian music, traditionally, it started off like Western music, Western classical music that is as a form of almost chant, if you will, as in the church that you have here, there would be in the temples. And it started off being temple music to becoming a music which was played in the courts, to now where it's played in the modern court, which is a concert performance hall. In our music, we've always, and my gurus, the way they taught it to me was, music is a way to reach God. And for me, oddly enough, some of the best moments for me performing, whether it's playing in my music room at home or playing on a stage in front of 10,000 people, is when I almost forget that I'm playing, and I become like a vehicle where you ask me afterwards what should I play, and I won't even be able to tell you. It's like I'm just playing and just sort of watching it just sort of happen. It's almost like how some athletes describe being in the zone. And I think that, whether you're playing in a concert hall, or whether you're playing in a church, or whether you're playing in a stadium, or whether you're just playing at the feet of your guru, you're trying to reach that stage where you're not trying anymore. It just happens.
From ancient Mesopotamia along the Silk Road to the emperors in China and the Mughals in South Asia, from the Moors in Al-Andalus to Tudor England and Stuart Scotland, the family of the oud captivated musicians across medieval and early modern Eurasia.